Let's see if it records. Okay, all right, there it goes. And then I'm going to present, just bear with me here. Grandpa's trying to figure out the VCR. All right. Okay. Okay, so let's see. Can you guys see that on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, appreciate that. Thank you. All right, so what we're gonna do here, we're just gonna go through the Google Slides. With every when we start a new kind of section or new chapter with that, I'm always going to have the first slide being the chapter and then the section that we're covering. All right. So obviously we're starting with chapter 1. Chapter 1 is titled "The First Humans," and they're going to give you a time frame here: prehistory to 3500 BC. Now this is something that and it's a little confusing at first with this class, but if a lot of you guys are seniors, you probably took U.S. history last year, and so you really didn't necessarily deal with a lot of kind of chronological kind of terms. So what we're dealing with in world history is generally two kind of classifications for kind of events, BC and AD. So BC stands for the birth of Christ, right? So BC stands for before Christ, I should say. So when it says 3500 BC, that means it was 3,500 years before the birth of Jesus. This is obviously a Christian-centric model on dating events, something that was kind of officially established by the Catholic Church in the 16th century, if you will. All right, now with BC, it essentially kind of counts down. What I mean that an event that occurred, let's say in 3500 BC, occurred before or is older than an event, let's say, that occurred in 500 BC. So the higher the number in the classification of BC, the older the event. Now with AD, and AD, a misconception is that it stands for after death, but it's actually a Latin term that means Anno Domini, which means the year of our Lord. So that is essentially basically like 1 AD. That's the year that apparently Jesus was born, all right, supposedly. All right, and so AD essentially counts up. So the lower the number, the older the event. So technically, like our year 2020 is actually AD 2020. It's been 2,020 years since the birth of Jesus. I'm going to give you guys a kind of a handout on some certain kind of chronological terms to kind of help you out. We're going to have a worksheet next week that may be a little confusing, kind of talking about BC. So I'm going to try to keep you guys kind of straight on that. It's a little confusing at first, but then you'll kind of figure it out. And our first 4 chapters, at least first 3 chapters for sure, are primarily dealing with BC. All right. Or first 2, I should say. Chapter 3, we do a little bit in AD. All right. Now, what this is dealing with primarily, this chapter is essentially dealing with prehistory. All right. And the difference between prehistory and what you guys had signed up for, history, is essentially writing, right? The evidence of written records. So prehistory is essentially the study of the past prior to the development of written records. History is mainly, not completely, but mainly the study of the past based on written records, right? So when you guys last year took U.S. history, with U.S. history, you got a little bit more insight into events, like things like the Declaration of Independence. We kind of had an idea of what the founding fathers had in mind when they had their dispute with Great Britain, because they wrote it down. Or the Emancipation Proclamation. We know what its intentions were because it was written down. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean history can't be manipulated, or that history tells a full, complete story. In many cases, history is the kind of past as written by those who are in power, or those the victors, as they would. All right. But even in certain kind of, like when you analyze history, the kind of some of the views on events that occurred in the past change as kind of times change as well. All right. So, like for example, if you were, let's say, people were studying in 1,000 years the presidency of Barack Obama, and the only information that they got was from, let's say, Fox News, they would assume that Barack Obama was Satan. Now, reversely, let's say if somebody was studying the kind of the presidential kind of the years of George W. Bush, and all they got was information was from like MSNBC, then they would think that he was Satan. All right. And so history a lot of times can be manipulated, all right, based on who's writing it and also who's interpreting it. All right. However, with prehistory, it's definitely a little bit harder to get a kind of a full story, if you will. All right. Now, those who are dealing in prehistory are primarily looking at two classifications to kind of tell the story or fill in the blanks, if you will, and that's fossils and artifacts. And so fossils, obviously, the remains of any living organism. This, like most famously, a lot of when we think about fossils, we generally think of bones, right? Like dinosaurs and such. However, it can be anything also living, like plants and such. So in the story of the Iceman, obviously the fossil that was basically left behind would be his remains. All right. And it wasn't just bones. There's evidence of skin as well. But also anything that was used like for like his quiver or whatever, like the idea, like anything that he would, use to kind of make stuff, right, that had been living at one point. Those objects that are made and kind of shaped by people in the past are also referred to as artifacts. All right. And so in the story of the Iceman, right, the artifacts would be his fur robe, all right, or his rucksack, things of that nature, all right, that flint arrowhead, right. So those things, like, why is he using it? Obviously, we know that he has a fur robe that this was winter, right? So we know that he lived in a cold climate area and he adapted to the climate as such. He had a bow and arrow for maybe hunting or protection and so on and so forth. All right. But we're not totally sure because he didn't write it down. All right. And so there's a little bit of kind of filling in the blanks, so to speak. All right. And so while you guys kind of did a little bit, while you had written evidence on those eight statements on the prehistory activity, you formulated a story, which you're just given a little bit of information. You came up with with a hypothesis and some conclusion that made sense. Like we had talked about how like the one thing that was probably a little confusing was the 110 pounds. Was it the Iceman who weighed 110 pounds? Was his rucksack? Was his robe? All those were possible scenarios, and they all made sense. All right. And then when we got the full article, it kind of came to we got the idea that it was he himself who weighed 110 pounds. All right. And so examples, obviously, fossil remains here. This is from an archaeological dig in South America. Obviously, you see bones there. Artifacts, like kind of a compare and contrast in some artifacts here. So these were artifacts that were found in North America. I believe is in the Ohio Valley. So we know that the culture there, the kind of the woodland culture, they had agriculture. There's evidence of seeds and such, but even things like this adze and this axe, that would be used for plowing the fields, the kind of bows for hunting, if you will. But we know if they're farming, that they're probably going to stay in one place a longer period of time. All right. And then something like this, which we have a large prehistoric site just straight up the street from us here, and that's at Cahokia, which is a major archaeological site. It was at one point the largest settlement north of Mexico prior to the arrival of Europeans. Right. And there's these things called chunky stones that they have there. They're kind of similar to this, which were basically kind of like almost like lawn bowling. So those who were kind of studying prehistory kind of determined that this is a culture that basically was advanced. They had farming, agriculture. They stayed in one place, and they also were engaging in kind of like extracurricular activities, entertainment and such, if you will. Now, conversely, these are artifacts that are found roughly around the same time, around AD 1000, but this is in Ireland, and they look a little bit different, right? Obviously with the kind of use of more metals. So we kind of determined this was more of a kind of an Iron Age culture. All right, there is the kind of evidence of weaponry. This is probably around a kind of early Viking settlement. All right. the kind of like the use here, this is kind of a misconception that Vikings wore these types of helmets into battle. This is probably what they determined used for kind of religious ceremonies. All right. So also having a kind of whether you find these kind of things, items that they believe were used for religious ceremonies, there's a concept of kind of an afterlife or kind of, a kind of a series of deities and such. All right. So these are all kind of things that are kind of used to kind of help fill in the blanks, if you will. Now, those people who are filling in the blanks with prehistory usually fall into two categories: archaeologists and anthropologists. So archaeologists are the ones who are studying the kind of the physical remains. Like the most famous archaeologists are paleoarchaeologists. They're the ones who are kind of digging up dinosaur bones and that. The people in Jurassic Park and such. What you guys were doing was more what we call anthropology. All right. Anthropologists are kind of basically taking not just like kind of like physical features and stuff and artifacts and that, but they're also kind of filling in the blank and trying to develop a story on who these people were. All right. And so in the story of the Iceman, there's actually kind of a combination of archaeologists and anthropologists. I'm going to show you this video that kind of talks about where they came to the conclusion, what happened to him. All right. So like I said, you guys were kind of doing anthropology where you were kind of basically filling in the blanks and kind of formulating a story. Now, as time, a lot of times those, even the, kind of like wide held kind of beliefs on certain theories can change over time, depending on new discoveries and such. All right. Like our chapter actually is a little outdated when we talk about the kind of the concept of human evolution. All right. Am I moving too fast? Those of you guys who are awake? Is it going too quick?
No.
You're good.
You're good? Okay. This is a video I was going to show you. I'm gonna skip out on this video here. All right, but what this was showing is kind of to tell the story, you really kind of also have to kind of date things, right? You have to kind of get an idea on when these artifacts were kind of like, when they existed and such. So this is where kind of like science and chemistry kind of play a role here. So there's two kind of popular ways of dating artifacts and remains. Probably the most famous one is radiocarbon dating, or what they call C14. All right. This was developed in the late 40s at the University of Chicago. The guy who's kind of credited with this, kind of leading the discovery of this, is a guy named Willard Libby, who also had worked on the Manhattan Project during World War II. Libby determined that every living kind of organism, fossil, anything that has lived, once they cease to exist, they start to lose carbon-14. All right, so when they start to decay, the less carbon-14 that you have in a fossil or an artifact, the older it is. All right, and so it can date material up to about 50,000 years old. All right, Libby's team, the first thing that they used radiocarbon dating on was actually a ship from Egypt that they kind of took off the wood from one piece of the wood from the ship, and they determined that it was around, I believe, like 1700 BC. All right, which I believe was like the New Kingdom period in ancient Egypt. All right, and so in the video that I was going to show you there, they've discovered these mummies in Peru, and one of the mummies also had coca leaves with them. The Cherubia culture had buried stuff with their dead, and they dated this mummy probably anywhere between 1300 and 1400 AD. All right, now that gives us a 100-year time frame based on the amount of carbon-14 that was in the coca leaf and in the some of the things that were around the girl, but. Let's say if somebody uncovered your remains and your mummified body in 1,000 years, and they determined that you lived anywhere between 1920 and 2020. All right, that's a big difference there. All right, in your story. All right, so it doesn't always give it exact, but it gets us kind of close, right? And then anything older. Oh, these is kind of shows the process from which it is. I'm going to show you guys maps, graphs, and charts all throughout this course because I watched the MTVs and I learned a few things. Young adults are into trap music, chocolate milk, chewing gum, and maps, graphs, and charts. The first three I can't provide for you, but the last one I hit you up with that all day, a day. All right, and then for anything older, The more popular way of dating would be the use of potassium argon dating. A lot of geological material, like they determine potassium argon dating, they use potassium argon dating to determine the age of the Grand Canyon. All right. And then when we talk about next week, the kind of concept of evolution, there's a number of discoveries that they use potassium argon dating for. One was footprints. They extracted the soil from the footprint that was made there. All right. So this is the last slide, but what I want to do is I want to show you guys a short video here on the Iceman, all right, and how they came to the conclusion on what had happened to him. All right. So, and I need to mute my mic, I believe, because I think someone said, play this. Oh, sorry. I'm going to mute my mic. I don't know why it's not showing up here.
Prehistoric people had no cities, central governments, or systems of writing.
This makes it especially difficult for us to learn about how they lived. Without written records, scientists must depend on other evidence to learn about the prehistoric past. Usually they work with artifacts like tools and pottery. But in 1991, they got a lucky break. Hikers in the Alps stumbled on the body of a man, mummified and frozen, melting out of the ice. But this wasn't the body of one of the hikers who go missing every year in this alpine region. This was a man who had died more than 5,000 years ago. He's the oldest human mummy ever found, a man 5,300 years old. Scientists call him Ötzi, or the Iceman. An arrowhead lodged in the Iceman's back suggested that he was murdered. Ötzi was an immediate archaeological sensation. Research teams eagerly studied both the mummy and his incredibly well-preserved gear.
Next check now.
A copper axe, an unstrung bow with a quiver of arrows, a flint knife, leather shoes, a woven grass cloak, and goatskin leggings. Could these remains tell them who he was, how he lived, and why he died up here in the mountains? Many researchers thought that Ötzi must have been an alpine shepherd, leading goats and sheep to high-altitude pastures in the summer. Shepherds today still herd livestock along the same path where Ötzi was found. If Ötzi was a shepherd, perhaps he was murdered for his sheep. Anthropologists Hans Platzgummer and Sylvia Reinhardt and archaeologist Anna Pedrotti decided to test this theory. They started by making an exact duplicate of Ötzi's clothes. When they were done, Hans donned the outfit. He would find out firsthand whether it could have held up to the tough life of an alpine shepherd. As Hans set off up the mountain on foot, Sylvia and Anna took an easier route by helicopter. For Hans, it was a grueling 4,000-foot climb to duplicate the Iceman's journey. From the mountaintop, Sylvia and Anna could see that Hans was having trouble. Modern-day shepherds use shovels to help them climb. Hans resorted to using the Iceman's axe. At last, he arrived exhausted. The three researchers examined the gear to see how it withstood the climb. His shoes were a disaster. They had no traction and they didn't keep out the water at all. But the cloak felt as warm as a winter jacket. The mysterious unstrung bow became the perfect climbing staff, and the copper axe helped Hans anchor himself on steep sections of the climb. But the poor performance of the shoes is the clincher.
This experiment went very good because it's the first time that we had the idea that we use the bow and also the axe for climbing up. And also we see that the shoes is totally broken and it's wet inside. And this is the result of the experiment. That's very good.
The poor performance of the shoes indicated that Ötzi probably wasn't a shepherd. Someone wearing shoes like this couldn't make a 4,000-foot mountain climb regularly. But if Ötzi wasn't a shepherd, why was he up here? One possibility is that Ötzi was involved in a fight in the valley below, was badly wounded, and fled up the mountain where he died. In the years ahead, researchers will continue to study Ötzi. They are confident that in time, the Iceman will reveal the story of his life and death. The Iceman was an important archaeological find because he was A. Dressed in a grass cloak, B. Murdered, C. Found in the Alps, D. Well.
Okay. So this is what he looked like when they uncovered him in the Alps there. So and this is right on the border with Italy and Austria, and there was actually a dispute on who had proper ownership of Ötzi. It was decided it was Austria's. He was on the Austrian side, if you will. All right, so you see that basically his skin is still pretty pliable there. It kind of looks like baked chicken to a certain extent. But like he's been pulled out every couple years here. Like I said, he's in a museum at a university, I believe, in Austria, and they kind of, like, I think last year they believed that he kind of suffered from intestinal parasites, maybe. But the theory was that he was a shepherd initially, and that he was kind of up in the mountains. He was killed for his sheep. But like the archaeologists and anthropologists kind of did this study, the clincher was that he probably wasn't up there because of his shoes. So the theory is, and again, it's a theory, that he was probably ostracized from a small group, murdered, and then tried to flee into the mountains and died. All right. But why he was there, again, we don't know, because guess what? He didn't leave behind written records. All right. So, all right, that is our first thing notes. Were you guys okay with that?
Yes.
You guys all right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to send out something on Monday, a worksheet on Monday. Close that out. Worksheet on Monday. That's going to introduce what we're going to talk about on Tuesday. All right. So look for that on Monday morning, and then I'm sorry, Wednesday. We'll meet on Wednesday. So I'm not going to send you guys anything on Tuesday. Wednesday we'll yeah, that is just like chicken skin. We'll sorry about that. We'll do another PowerPoint thing here. I'll send out the notes. And like I said, I'm going to put this up on Google Classroom if you want to go back to it, if you didn't get the notes. Roy, he is clearly made of peanut butter. He does look like that. Okay. All right. So, all right, guys. Well, I'm going to let you guys go. Have a good weekend. All right. I appreciate you coming to the meeting there. All right. Have a good one, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording.